Hey guys, welcome to part 3.
Let's take a listen to Senator and Shadow Indigenous Minister Jacinta Nampijinpa Price when asked about her view on the impacts of colonisation.
Senator Josh Butler from The Guardian, thank you for your speech. In your speech you claimed some Indigenous organisations, quote, want to demonise colonial settlement. Could I ask you please, do you believe the history of colonisation continues to have an impact on some Indigenous Australians?
No. I'll be honest with you, no, I don't think so. Positive impact, absolutely. I mean, now we've got running water, we've got readily available food. I mean, everything that my grandfather had when he was growing up, because he first saw whitefellas in his early adolescence, we now have. Otherwise, he would have had to live off the land, provide for his family, and all of those measures, which Aboriginal Australians, many of us, have the same opportunities as all other Australians in this country. And we certainly have probably one of the greatest systems around the world in terms of the democratic structure in comparison to other countries. It is why migrants flock to Australia to call Australia home, because the opportunity that exists for all Australians. But if we keep telling Aboriginal people that they are victims, we are effectively removing their agency and then giving them the expectation that someone else is responsible for their lives. That is the worst possible thing you can do to any human being, is tell them that they are a victim without agency. And that's what I refuse to do.
So you don't believe that... Just as a quick follow-up, you don't believe there's any negative ongoing impacts of colonisation on Indigenous Australians today? Just to confirm.
No, there's no ongoing negative impacts of colonisation. What I will say, which I have suggested obviously within my speech, is that particularly for my family in remote communities, again, who live very close to traditional culture, who experience the highest rates of violence in the country, family violence, interpersonal violence, they experience that not because of the effects of colonisation, but because it's expected that young girls are married off to older husbands in arranged marriages. Women, we haven't had a feminist movement for Aboriginal women because we've been expected to toe the line when it's come to Aboriginal activism for the rights of our race, but the rights as women have been second place. And I have the lived experience, my mother has the lived experience as someone who was subject to traditional custom and expected to become a second wife in an arranged marriage. There are still people living this way in this country, and yet those who have held a narrative because they have had an education and access to media ignore the plight of those in communities, and this can't continue to go on.
Thank you.
I have talked to Indigenous people, and I'm sure others have too, who talk about generations of trauma among Indigenous Australians as a result of colonisation. Whether that means that colonisation continues now is probably a separate question, but would you accept that there have been generations of trauma as a result of that history?
Well, I guess that would mean that those of us whose ancestors were dispossessed of their own country and brought here in chains as convicts are also suffering from intergenerational trauma. So I should be doubly suffering from intergenerational trauma.
When asked about the fact that Northern Territory votes wouldn't be counted towards a state majority, this was her response.
Well, they've been exploited again for the purpose of somebody else's agenda. This is what I've seen over and over again. It's come from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which, by the way, the word Uluru, I know from speaking to Arnongo elders, they are unhappy that the landmark and the name has been exploited for the purpose of a PR campaign for a referendum. Their voices aren't being heard. And isn't that just ironic that their voices aren't heard, although the Yes campaign have exploited their landmark for the purposes of this referendum. This is what has continued to occur, as I said, because the powerful who have had an education and access to media have controlled the narrative of Indigenous policy without letting those in remote communities really have a voice. And while they claim that this is about them, it's not about them. There are those proponents of the voice who have had years at the table. These failures are their responsibility also. They now seek for a transfer of power through our Constitution so that they can never be dismantled. But it is incumbent upon every single one of us not to just fly in a group of yes campaigners to celebrate 6 years since the signing of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and ignore the locals, and where the only locals that are in attendance are just the paid dancers. They need to actually listen to people on the ground.
Now let's hear from Professor Megan Davies on the process of creating the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
The process that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart was quite complex. I'd worked on it at UNSW for many, many years. I'd researched a lot of constitutions around the world that had constitutional recognition, and I looked at the processes that had led to that constitutional recognition, and we designed what we called the First Nations Dialogues. So the First Nation Dialogues were the constitutional meetings where a group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were selected by local land councils. It also had a historic consensus, meaning everybody endorsed the outcome of all of the dialogues in 13 regions, and that was to ask the Australian government for a referendum on a constitutionally protected voice. The voice to Parliament is the reform that the Uluru Statement from the Heart says is the most meaningful form of recognition for First Nations peoples. Many liberal democracies around the world create mechanisms such as the voice to Parliament to enhance Indigenous peoples' participation in the democratic life of the state.
To finish up, a final word from Senator Price.
We need to be listening to people like Sharon Long, the cousin of a young Indigenous girl who died hours after being sexually assaulted in a remote community, and her beautiful nieces and sisters that she cares for that are all here today. Recently, they made their way to Canberra to be heard, while Minister Burney, Prime Minister Albanese, and in fact the entire Labor government, Teals, and Senator David Pocock have been happily travelling the country to do events with leading activist yes campaigners. They couldn't find the time for them. They listened to the Qantas-sponsored leaders of the activist industry, but not to an ordinary Aboriginal woman actually on the ground, living the disadvantage they claim they care about. Sharon not only takes care of her siblings and nieces, but has recently brought her elderly grandmother from Bulla in the Northern Territory to her home in North Queensland, because her house in community was made unlivable when a male family member tried to set fire to his girlfriend in the room next to her nana's bedroom. Despite Sharon's calls to the Northern Land Council and other organisations to intervene and provide support for her grandmother, her cries have fallen on deaf ears. It is why Sharon has little faith in the multi-million-dollar organisations responsible for representing the needs of the vulnerable. Why would a voice be any better? Especially when its advocates hold nothing but contempt for those of us who question it and who challenge its intentions. The division must be rejected, and certainly must not be enshrined within our Constitution.
Okay guys, that wraps up part 3 on why people are voting no to the voice. And if you missed the full length video or part 1 and 2, you can click to watch them here. But what do you think? Do you agree with Senator Price's outlook? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because don't forget, that's what this channel's all about. The truth dies with silence. So, have your say.